Welcome.
Two.
Mine's
And
Reese's.
my name's Jason.
And my name's Michaela. We just want to take a quick moment to thank everyone who's tuning in today and everyone who's been supportive of our podcasts. We really appreciate all the time you've taken to join us.
Yeah, so thank you so much for all the support and comments on the things that we've done. This week we're going to be talking a little bit about classroom management, not specifically the topic itself, but more so like our experience in the past going through school with engaging classes and teachers who employed those type of methods, and our usage of classroom management skills and just like classroom etiquette things that we've used in classrooms both virtually and in person because of the scenario that we are in. So yeah, we're gonna get started with that. So I guess starting off, Michaela, um, what just some past experience on I guess any class that you realized in your I guess your primary and secondary schooling that just really kind of embodied that engagement and student-centric learning that we talked about.
Yeah, definitely. I've had a lot of wonderful teachers. So from the student perspective, I a couple of teachers come to mind specifically at this moment for being really great at engaging the class. I had an English teacher in high school. Actually, I had a few great English teachers in high school. One of them used to be a stand up comedian, so he's really definitely fit for the job of a high school teacher. He was great at keeping us engaged, whether that was occasionally making a strange sound effect or saying just really quick and witty things. And he was great at using many different uh, vehicles of learning and getting content across to us. We use different types of technology, different types of projects. Yeah, he was just on all kinds of different pages to help us be engaged. And then, of course, my music teacher, again, uh, in a very similar way, used many different facets of learning for us. And we had quiet music classes where there were no spoken directions. We had music classes where we were moving around. We had just all kinds of different things to keep everybody engaged and interested, making the material more relevant.
That's really cool. I also think you had mentioned one of your high school teachers, English teachers, was a comedian and kind of did like stand up and stuff. And I think that skill, that type of communication skill and reading audience, because I think as a teacher, you are essentially performing in a sense that you're in front of the classroom and your audience is the student, and how you get the students engaged in your conversation and in your topic is so important. That parallel, I guess I'd never realized that parallel before, but I think that skill of communication is like key to like the center of something that we as I guess any type of profession communication is key. But as a teacher, the way you communicate and the way that you present yourself to your students is gonna be like the most impactful thing of how the students are gonna view you. I always like to think about um when thinking back to like my primary schooling and secondary schooling education, how like the first impression of a teacher that they gave the first day of school was always the most crucial one, because it kind of like for not even just for me but like the other students, if the first day the teacher came in and it was kind of like just like they could tell that they weren't in control of the classroom, they were done. Like the class itself would not fully pay attention regardless how try the teacher had to do, teacher had to work with, and it was always going to be that uphill battle. And there's also the other side of the thing where this class is so strict that it's almost like you don't ever want to speak out or do anything out of line, which I don't think is also good, because it kind of that we need you would want your students to have some leeway so that they can feel safe and open in that environment. And I think that between like having no control and having super control, it's all about finding that balance of like you present yourself in a way that the classroom is going to be open and open for discussion, open to comments, but also having structure. And I think that structure, a lot of times in classes that I've been in, the teachers that have gotten me engaged in the class are those who like talk in a sense that make me feel like I want to learn this topic and present the information in a way that is something that I can like get behind. And then also when things needed to be stringent, they like kind of planned it out within their lesson itself, where the classroom structure was built in day one, and we just continued that structure all the way through. And so that's a little bit of my experience. I don't have any specific teachers. I will say English teachers, I think, especially in high school for me, or a lot of those teachers who kind of spoke to me in that way, and I think I connected with a lot of my English teachers in that regard. And of course, the music classroom in the same way, but also because in a band setting, you really can't talk if you're playing because you got a thing in your face. And I'm sure in choir as well, you can't speak when you're singing, and it's a lot, but it's a lot harder to get away with like talking when you're because you can tell blatantly instruments down, you're not playing or you're not making noise. So I think that's also another classroom management thing that I guess music
Yeah.
educators can kind of employ. Like they're not playing their instrument, it's clear that they're probably not something's wrong.
Although, to be fair, students are resilient and incredibly creative, so I'm sure
Oh,
they'd
that is
find
true. Yes.
something to say. Yeah. So, I would love to know, Jason,
Yes.
what are your experiences from the teacher perspective with classroom management?
To be honest, my classroom management skills, especially for the classes that I have taught, have been pretty like. I'm not like the best at classroom management, like the highest regard. Like I'm not like superb at it, and it's still something that I am still working on. But the like I said before, first interaction type of thing, where I always make sure that my first interaction with the students is that idea that I'm creating this environment that you can be open with me and you can ask questions and everything, and I'll be happy to respond in a positive manner. But I think the biggest thing that I kind of formulate with classroom management is energy and just reading classroom energy, and I'll present myself either giving more energy or less energy if needed, depending on the class, and just building that communication and that kind of relationship with the student right away. That first lesson is going to be the most important to how classroom management works in the future. And I've employed techniques if students get off task. It's like, especially in general music classrooms, doing like the clapping thing, or that you clap something and they repeat it back. Because somehow instinctually, it's engraved in us that when someone does the clapping pattern, they clap back. And it just, I don't know why. It always works. Or if you say, like, if you can hear my voice, clap twice. And then they clap twice. Or like, if you like you I've done this for marching band. I've seen people do it for like just to get the class, just to get people back together, especially after like after a break, especially. It's say, if you can hear, raise up your right hand, put your right hand down, put your left hand up, left hand out. Like they do these techniques just to get
Love those.
themselves mentally engaged again. And I think that's also an activity that we are told to like do, as especially in choir settings where you do an intro activity just to get the brain warmed up and thinking about music. And I think how you structure that lesson within your planning is how I have done classroom management. Is if I structure it in a way that the class is managed and I can transition through the processes of it, it usually works out. There have been, of course, times where I slip up or I get lost in time, like the scenario, and things have gotten out of hand. But they're very minimal, and usually I can get the classroom back in time. But how about you? You definitely have more general music teaching experience than I do. I've only done the one for our externship at Temple, but you do a lot of work with outside of school, of course, with that.
Um, so I've had a lot of very different experiences as far as classroom management goes, and I am definitely still learning how to get better at it. So a quick little story to give you a sense of where I've started in classroom management. I was filling in for somebody for a class that was like it wasn't just music necessarily. It was kind of like just a general performance class for very young children, like probably around first, second grade. And I was wildly unprepared when I stepped into the role of the main teacher. And man, did that show because it was me versus 12 young children who just it's like they could smell when like you're not as prepared teach them and they are ready to go. um, yeah, and it was an incredibly frustrating experience both for me and for the students because I just did not anticipate how much preparing I had to go in a class of just like 12 kids. Yeah, I've learned a lot since then. um, and I think basically classroom management boils down to a couple of factors, one of them being preparedness, and that means preparing a lesson plan, preparing enough objectives and activities to hold students' attention, They say that you can take a student's age if they're 8 years old. Okay, you have 8 minutes for each activity to hold their attention at the most. I've seen that to be true. Um, and it could vary, but that's a pretty good rule of thumb in my experience so far. But we have preparedness, um, and that's transitions from one activity to the next to keep them engaged. And your pacing is really important. So, like you were saying, reading the room, kind of gauging where the students are at. Maybe they come in and it's kind of a weird day for some reason, and perhaps you need to take a different route than you were planning on. So, being able to think on your feet like that. Uh, yeah, so that's like one really important aspect of classroom management in my experience. And the other crucial part of classroom management, which we've talked a little bit about, is the relation between a teacher and a student, like just the respect and the caring that needs to be there for the student to want to learn. Because as teachers, we're not books, we don't just give them information. We want to inspire them to learn. We want to give them a reason to want to know the information we would like to share with them. And without that, there's no teaching. So they have to know that we want them to succeed and we care about their well-being. And I think in my experience that's probably the most important part of classroom management. And I've been talking for a while, so I'll wrap it up. But I would like to think of, instead of like controlling the energy of the students we are presented with, I think I told you this analogy last week, but I think of it like the students come in and they present us with a certain amount of energy and a certain type of energy, whatever it may be. And it's frequently a lot. And it's not our job to try to like control it as much as it is to direct it, to guide it. Kind of like if we, if we were Santa Claus on a sleigh and they like the energy they were giving us was the reindeer, like we're not going to tell them to stop. We're going to tell them let's go this way and let's try this direction.
Yeah. No, I completely agree about like going with the flow of like that energy where the class is just directing it because I frequently see that in classes like sometimes the energy is really high and I think you as the teacher have to match the energy or even greater just so that
Yeah.
they know that kind of like not that you're in charge but like that you're about to lead it somewhere and you kind of want it to be naturally led and less so than like push force in that direction. And I think that also comes down to how you start the activity and how you warm down. And we had talked a little bit about well, in some of our readings, just about thinking about how you're planning your lesson and how you distribute that energy. Because most times, start of the class, usually, especially I think primarily just in general music settings, depending on what time of day you're in, your energy of the class can be very high or very low. And you just kind of had to go with that mood. And you either had to warm them up to that activity or start by warming them down into a simpler activity so you can continue the lesson and then build up again. And then by the end of class, you want to warm them back down so they aren't riled up for their next class. And
Right.
I think that idea of like kind of controlling the energy of like expanding upon it or lowering it kind of all goes down to that same term of management or how you're managing that pacing and how your lesson is actually going is another great tool to use within your management classroom. And we had actually talked a little about that in when we were discussing in one of our classes about teaching students with special needs, students who have ADHD and ADD had different varying levels of energy and engagement, and they sometimes hyper focus and whatnot. And we had to kind of realize that and plan out our lesson accordingly so that the class itself can kind of the energy itself can move at that pacing and that we're not forcing the student to like either stay hyper engaged and so we're trying to just let their minds slowly sink out of it so that they can move on to the next activity and we had to plan that within our lesson so that those students who have those special need requirements or such things that they work with that we can get them past that.
Yeah, definitely.
And I loved your topic about care. I think care itself, just the class, like we both have talked about it, how care, like if you can show that you care about your students and the students realize that within the stuff you talk about and the stuff you teach, they are more likely to gonna want to follow you and listen to you. And if you like if you blatantly show that you either don't care or you're just trying to get through the material, like you don't care about the material, they can read it. They will smell that out. Like you said, students have an uncanny ability to just smell either fear or inconfidence in you. and we as teachers have to, even if we don't know the material, which I hope everybody does, they pre-plan and everything, that we have to be confident in what we're showing them, because they
Yeah,
will read it and they will take it and run with it.
right. And even like even with that, as we've talked about before, it's even okay when we don't have the answer to a question. And sometimes I mean, the content we're preparing to teach them, hopefully we know. But sometimes content is brought up by the students or by whatever circumstances, and we don't have the answers. And just having the the confidence in ourselves and the acceptance of the reality that we don't know everything and we're not even close to knowing everything, and that's okay. You know, if a student asks a question that we don't have an answer to, then just acknowledging I don't know, but we'll figure that out together, and being able to acknowledge that and then move on is really important.
And I think that's really true. And also, going off of that point, something that this whole idea about choosing your battles, I think it kind of falls in that same category, where I think you should frequently, if a student asks a question, of course, you should always engage in that question to make sure that the students are heard. And even if you don't know the answer, be like, oh yeah, I'm not actually sure. Like, maybe we can try figuring it out together. Like, if you have the time to do it, definitely do it, because that also, like we said before, builds a level of care. But there are moments where some students could be disruptive, is not the best word, but like that can throw off your entire lesson. You have to figure out how to get back in. And there's some times where students will bring up topics that will bring you off course, or that like I said before, disrupt the lesson, and you have to kind of pick and choose what kind of battles you decide to engage with. Because let's say a student is talking for the first time in the back of a rehearsal or something. Like, how do you deal with that? Do you immediately like turn to them while you're rehearsing with them to be like, "Hey, let's stop talking," or do you kind of just like let it play out? If it's not bothering the majority of the class, you should, for me at least, if it's the first time doing it, I usually just kind of ignore, or I kind of give them a look and be like, "Hey, quiet down," instead of stopping the entire class and being like, "Hey, we're not talking right now." And I think the uses of proximity, I think we both have used that ability before, of just like getting closer to students who maybe acting, or talking during a lesson, or maybe positioning yourself in a way where students can keep themselves engaged. Like your movement around the class is also a great tool for keeping students engaged because they have to physically look at where you're going, and how animated you are with your movements kind of helps with keeping them engaged as well.
Yeah, and that actually just reminded me, I just wrote it down so I didn't forget. Going back to something you said earlier about the structure of a class, you know, the first class, setting up that structure, the expectations that we set for our students are very important, and play a huge role in classroom management as well. Setting up the expectations that don't talk in class unless we kind of determine, okay, this is
Mhm.
an open discussion, go ahead and talk, and that kind of thing is really important. And like you're saying, picking your battles, choosing what's something that is necessary to stop the flow of the entire class to deal with versus something that you could fix by simple proximity as a reminder, or maybe quick eye contact as a reminder. Because I think a lot of the time students do not have the intention of causing trouble. Sometimes they do, but a lot of the time they don't. And being able
Yeah.
to make quick judgment of what type of reaction does this call for from me as the teacher is really another big thing for classroom management.
Yeah. And I know that a lot of the stuff we're talking about is like it's a lot of information and it's a lot of stuff that you can prepare as best as you can outside the classroom, but it's not something that you're gonna be able to do by just reading like a textbook or just learning about the process of it. And a lot of the skills that we've developed come from actually physically going into the environment and being in that environment because it is so different. And as like I think as a pre-service teacher and coming to be hopefully a teacher in the field, that's something that you had to expose yourself to. And I think the biggest takeaway is being uncomfortable in this setting, of course, is good. And I think you had to live in that uncomfortability in the classroom to be able to become familiar and comfortable with it. And it's definitely something when I did my first teaching, even just in our own class itself, that I felt wildly unprepared for, even no matter how much work I put into the actual lesson. And it was always a growing process where I had to learn where I was comfortably, and then just thinking about how I can push myself into that area of uncomfortability, or teaching an age group which I may have not engaged in before, or working with students who I have not previously worked with before as well. Just continuously edging myself towards, but raising my level of comfortability in the classroom regardless of the situation.
Yeah. So I have a question for you, Jason.
Yes.
Do you have any practical steps or tips for lesson planning um, for anybody who's maybe new to teaching of what they could do to prepare themselves for any sort of classroom management uh, success?
My biggest tip for any type of like lesson planning is always scaffolding and thinking about how you're breaking, especially I always think backwards and then forward. So if I'm looking at like a classroom that I'm always looking at the goal first and thinking, okay, now how do I go from point A to point B? Like how am I doing that? And how am I building upon it and building that expectation? Like you always want to think that your students, though they know things, you've always want to build the expectation that they don't know anything. Just so you're prepared for every single possible outcome. Because there are some times where the lesson moves on seamlessly and the students all understand it. And there are other times where you get in there and they have no idea what's happening, and you have to either inform them or use your nonverbal gestures or nonverbal cues to get them in that right direction. And it just takes a little bit of time. And for me, it's all come down to how I laid out the lesson and how much information I can prepare before actually even getting into the class that has helped me succeed in classroom management through the lesson plan, and also building in questions. It's something that kind of sounds kind of dumb, which is writing in questions into your lesson plan to ask the class and writing even expected answers that you had to kind of react to. And that's just another level of preparedness that we had to if you program your questions into your lesson plan, you probably won't forget them and you'll ask them and engage the students, and then their feedback to you kind of lets you measure where they're at and what they're thinking about, and you can kind of guide that feedback into your next question or your next lesson. And itself is so important because I think classroom management falls the best or is mostly used not so much in the lesson itself but between each part of the lesson, and how you guide that energy in their and what they're giving you, that feedback, is how you can transition into the next part more seamlessly. And of course, I'm primarily speaking like a setting such as like a band room or a choir room in that regard. But in general music settings, you'll usually have activities that you plan to do between different parts of your lesson. And the more you can practice that transition, and the more that you practice those activities between lessons, is going to build your success in being able to fully transition to the next step seamlessly. And for any pre-service teachers out there, that preparation is crucial. And you just sitting in a practice room or sitting in your dorm room, going through the process, reading through your lesson plan, and actually practicing it maybe on your roommates or other peers and colleagues is so important to do, and something that you should always use your colleagues in that regard. Like have them listen to your lesson or have them reflect on or have them come into your lesson space and run the lesson through with them, just so you can see if it'll work or not. And I think that's something that we as pre-service teachers don't nearly do as much as we should, is using the people around us as resources, because we are also a resource for them because we also have things that maybe they didn't think of, and just that whole community of working together to figure out, oh, this doesn't quite work, I should modify that, or they could, or even realize, oh, that worked really well, I can continue using it. So
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yeah,
my lesson planning tips, just things.
yeah. Practicing is crucial. I know for me, when my best lessons have always been the ones where I spoke through my lesson plan at least twice, so that I know exactly how I want to say the information that I would like to say. And writing in the questions is also really important because asking students questions is it's huge. It's really really helpful for them to learn the information because that gives them you're giving them a problem that they need to solve. If I said, Jason, what
Yes.
do you think the square root of 36 is, and for some reason you just didn't know, you'd think about it and you'd want to have the answer to that. You'd want to know how to get there, right?
Is it six? I don't know math.
Yes,
It
great.
is six, is it? But no, I completely understand. No, 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 that makes. Sorry, I was like, what is the square root of 36?
Music people and math is, yeah, but but another really important aspect of lesson planning with for good engagement in classroom management is having a hook, something to interest the students,
Mhm.
something that my supervisor, I guess, for the general music class, working with now says all the time is don't tell us what you're going to do, just do it. It's so much more interesting if I stand in front of the class and say, hi, and start playing a song on the guitar, and then move into what I want them to do and how I want them to interact in that. It's significantly more engaging. And you mentioned transitions. Having a transition between activities and parts of the lesson will keep the students engaged. And if you have trouble with students talking and getting off task, you could engage their mouths by having them sing or do some sort of like a rhythm or like a chant or something. Engine number nine's a good one. I love that one to get them moving. If you need them to go from point A to point B in the classroom and you need them to do it without talking or getting off task, that's a good one. And also taking little brain breaks during a lesson because sometimes they just need sometimes you as a teacher need to step back to regroup and remember what's next, and sometimes they need a moment to step back and do something that's just a little less I guess intense.
Hmm.
But I would love to talk with you more about the importance of caring about students and students feeling cared for.
Yeah, and we had actually read some articles that we had previously read in some classes, and also some that we just kind of prepared for this, just because they were such good articles. And I think great articles to reflect on, especially when we're thinking about care and everything. And one of them was an article called "Language of Care" by his last name is Nodding. Could not get forgot the first name, but it was written back in 2012, and it talks about the idea of care in the classroom, like we had mentioned before. I think that stemming idea of this overarching care is something that me and Michaela both frequently invest in. That we much rather invest in care than focus on maybe if the lesson gets off task, but you're dealing with something that needs more attention because it's gonna help preserve your student teacher relationship, then I think, for me at least, it's like I would much rather veer off course of the lesson for a little bit to work in that scenario and then move it back in than just be like, then ignore it
Yeah,
and move it forward. So I think ignoring a student, especially if it's actually if they're trying to get something from you, is the worst thing you can do, and it kind of just not diminish, but like it kind of sets you a foot back to getting towards and knowing the students themselves. And I think that that itself is so important that we had mentioned before, you have to care about both the subject you're teaching and the students and how they're learning, and the students, and by just doing that, the students will hopefully realize that you care about their education, and they'll kind of reciprocate that feeling back. And it's all about kind of like give and take, that if you want to present something, you have to like give it to them in a way that they're going to accept it so that they can get on board with you. And there's nothing worse than a teacher trying to force you onto the tracks. I was just thinking about trains, but forcing you onto their lesson and just making you do things for the sake of doing it.
yeah. I mean, how many times like somebody says, "Hey, do this thing." How many times have you at least in your head gone, "No"?
Yeah.
Somebody tells you in school like, "Hey, go over here, go stand over here and do this thing for this assignment." You're like, "I don't want to." No,
Yeah.
no.
Also, a
That,
great thing to just practice is whenever you're giving instructions verbally, just don't say "may you" or like don't say "please." Just be like, just be like, "We're going here," or like, "Let's do this." Like you don't give them an option because
yeah,
they're in fact they're not in control of the class. So if
yeah.
you don't
Or
give them the option, it really helps you kind of build that relationship. Like, hey, we're doing this. There's no question that we're not.
at least don't just steer clear of the "can you" or "would you
Yeah.
like to"
Mhm.
unless you're really prepared for the response of "no."
Yep.
Can you
And
please stand up? No. Can you
yeah.
please put your shoes back on? No.
Yeah, I've definitely fallen that hole before in the past, where like I would say, because it's polite, can you?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. We have a professor who likes to say, likes to invite us to engage in the class in
Mhm.
certain ways, which, as long as your students kind of understand what that means, I like that option.
Mhm.
Hey, whenever you're ready to join us, we'd love to have you, but your other option is sitting quietly in your chair. We'll be over here, So
Yeah.
they have a choice,
Mhm.
but there's a very clear right choice to make.
Yeah, and there are, of course, student to student, some students will be engaged, some students will not. And sometimes it's not because they don't want to be engaged. Sometimes they just need the time, especially if they're having a rough day or they're coming from a different class and everything and they're thinking about something else. It's okay, especially in general music settings, to give them the time. I realize that if you give them hey, we're gonna move on to this activity. If you want to sit there, it's okay. You can come join us whenever we're ready. And then like maybe periodically throughout the lesson, really you can invite them to come with you in the activity that you're doing. Because like I said, you have to build that environment where it's okay for students to not participate if they aren't feeling ready to participate or they just if because we can't get into the minds of every student because if we
Yeah.
could that'd be great but we had to think about like oh they're human they're human beings as well, they're not just kids, they're dealing with their own things. And I think that's something that we as teachers have to realize, that students can teach us a lot of things, and the way they respond to us is not just like a childish thing. They're responding to us as humans would respond to each other, and we have to recognize that they're not just children. They're in fact people that have their own thoughts and their own processes of thinking, and we had to invite that and allow that to happen within our classroom.
Yeah, something that I definitely have learned in teaching a general music class is that going along with the caring relationship and just being understanding and empathetic. Sometimes students, yeah, like they'll say like, "Oh, my head hurts," and it doesn't. They're fine, but um, there are some times where students just like we all bring with us the, I guess, kind of the baggage of our lives outside of
Hmm.
the classroom, whatever that may be, or whatever environment we're coming from. And there was one class where one student who usually doesn't have too much trouble uh, doing what we're asking of the students to do
Mm.
just wasn't having it. He wasn't feeling it. Um, and so I had an opportunity to go talk to him and make the choice of approaching him in a way where I'm assuming he's trying to be defiant or genuinely asking him what why he's not participating. And so I said, "Are you okay?" He's like, "I'm just really tired." And so he just sat out and yeah, that was class for him. And then the next day he was fine.
Yeah.
But sometimes students just life that we don't see hits them in some way, or just yeah, sometimes they need a moment. And being empathetic and understanding of that, not where they could kind of walk all over you and say like, "I need to go to the nurse because my finger hurts," or it did 5 days ago. Like it, kind
Yeah.
of being
Hmm.
the difference.
Yeah.
But on the topic of student and teacher relationships, um, and like just what that means to care about a student. Something one of our professors said to our class a couple years ago was that if you're someone who needs to have in like any sort of like person to person relationship an equal caring, teaching is not the right profession for you, because as a teacher you need to care so much about these students and their well-being, um, and you need to know that they're not going to reciprocate it
Yeah.
a lot of the time in this, and it definitely not in the same way. Um, so that unequal kind of um, caring is a really big part of teaching. There should be a mutual respect, um, but you have to be willing to just care so much about so many people without necessarily having them like have that same sort of like, "Oh, I hope you're doing okay," as you do for them.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, but when that does happen, it is quite nice that sometimes students will, because I've seen classrooms where I'm not having a good day, and the students will ask me if I'm all right, and I'm like, oh, that's really sweet. But I
Yeah.
just, it's and that's kind of what gets me through certain teachings. Is like sometimes, of course, we as teachers are also human beings, and we are dealing with our things as well, and just trying to think away from that. And if we build that care relationship, our students will, confront us about it because they're also concerned about us in certain scenarios. And of course, like you said, they're not always going to care, or they're not always going to actually do that. And there are a few cases that they do, and that's always great. But I I do want to mention this one article that mentions, it's an article by Jill Reese and talking about like the 4 C's of classroom management. And I just want to ask you about your thoughts on these 4 C's. And the 4 C's of classroom management that's mentioned by Jill Reese in her article, which was written back in 2007, was commendation. Sorry, I'm reading this right. Commendation, communication, consistency, and content.
Yeah. Um, I mean, that kind of sums up, I think, everything we've been talking about. Um, just going back to, I suppose, so content. Um, obviously, what we're teaching, like the reason we are here is to teach them about something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we have our, for music educators, we have our musical content that we would like to communicate to them,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to the whatever sort of life lessons they're going to be learning at that point in the class. But being confident about the content we're teaching is, for me, in my experience, it's been essential to being able to teach with confidence and being able to communicate. They say if you can teach something, you really understand it.
Mm-hmm.
You can understand something and not be able to teach it, but when you can teach it, you really have to like
Yeah.
know it down to its core.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Would you like to
Oh
get
yes.
in?
I think like the four C's, so accommodation, communication, consistency, and content are just like clear goals that you should have set up in your classroom. Where I think there should always, especially in general music classrooms, especially commendation, giving praise. I think it's always great to give praise where praise is due. You should always compliment on your students if they did something well. And then kind of like with that compliment, build in some feedback. Like you want to give some compliments, some feedback, and then another compliment maybe. Like you have to build out how you're doing that feedback. And I think commendation, sorry, is it commendation? Yeah, commendation, that just like giving them that sense of like reward for a little bit is always good, and that also builds into communication. That if you're praising them, it kind of helps them build that positive, like, that they can succeed and that they're doing good, which is always crucial into just the classroom itself and getting students engaged in the class. And the consistency is something that like I this is something that I frequently also had to work on, especially if you're not the primary teacher in the class. In our cases, a lot of the times we're coming in to visit and teach, and we're not actually the actual only teacher in the class. But making sure that our presence is always consistent, how we're setting up the lesson is always consistent, and that we keep the same consistent classroom expectations. Like we can't let one student get away with something and then blame and like yell at another student for doing that same exact thing. You have to think about like you have to give that give and take where these are the rules and they must be followed just so that there's that semblance of classroom management there pre-programmed into how you're presenting everything, and just building consistency also in your lesson plan. Like you always start with this step, you always do this next and that, so that students have a flow and idea of what the lesson is going to be, so that they can stay engaged when the time's needed. And then of course content, Michaela mentioned, content is important because of confidence in how you're presenting things is crucial to how the students will receive it at the end.
And jumping back to consistency, that goes in that refers to setting the expectations, like we've talked about a few times now, for the way that the class is going to be run. You know, you raise your hand to go to the bathroom. You um, like no talking between this and this, just that kind of thing. Setting up those expectations, and the expectation of respect from student to student, teacher to student, student to teacher,
Mm,
and also being consistent in the way that we respond to students. Um, so if we came in one day and we're just having a really bad day, and somebody said something that just did not sit well with us, and for whatever reason, like if we as the teacher just went and just exploded or something and like yelled at them, and then the next day came in and they were kind of like a little shaken up, and if you were like, oh no, everything's fine, I would never yell at you, like being
yeah.
consistent
Mm,
in how we talk to students and in the ways we respond to things is really important to
yeah.
build that trust.
And I think it all comes down to how you're building that classroom environment, like how you're setting yourself up for the students. And then care is the overarching goal that we all need to think about, is how we're caring about the students and how they care about us, and type of that relationship back and forth. And I think that's about a lot of the stuff about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that you want to just like a quick tip for any pre-service teachers or any teachers out there just about
Um,
that?
I think probably just care and practice
Hmm.
are probably the two most important things, because we've talked now about the structure of a lesson, expectations, caring, gaining experience, scaffolding, um, transitions, all of that. And I think boiled down, it comes down to caring about the students and then practicing and preparing.
Yeah. And then going off of that note, I would also, yeah, same as what Michaela said, I agree 100% with everything that she said. Just also this idea that, especially since we're now online, so the format that we're in, that those same skills will also be successful in those settings. And we as teachers have to realize that we can't be perfect. We're still learning this process as well. If we present it in that way, the students will realize that, I mean, the students are also dealing with that same type of stress and being online and everything. So the classroom management skills are still the same. You're still worrying about you're still doing care, you're still planning content, you're still thinking about how the lesson progresses, just in a different format, of course. So just keep in mind that those same skills still apply for these online lessons and online classes. And then for as like a tip, it's okay, especially for pre-service teachers, like I said before, be uncomfortable. It's okay to be in an uncomfortable setting because that's when you truly learn how you're going to progress. And it's okay to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes in the classroom management setting, and you can't beat yourself. You should reflect on it and think about, okay, how can I do better on it, instead of just wallowing, thinking about, oh, I messed up, I'm not going to be able to do it. You always have to think that every situation that you're put in is a learning situation, and you will get better through time, through more practice. And you have to be okay with messing up a few times to gain that knowledge and experience. I think is crucial. So I guess with that, that's gonna wrap up our episode of Lines and Spaces today. Again, thank you to everybody for their continued support and watching us. We love doing this and we love talking about this topic that we're very this topic of music education and music in general that we're both very dedicated and I don't know what I'm thinking of, but we're
Passion.
very passionate about. Yes, passion is the word that I was thinking about. And we would also love to hear some questions from you. Just thinking about if you guys have any questions or topics that you might want us to cover or talk about or think through. Definitely leave us a comment on our YouTube page. I think a lot of our comments. Give us a review on Apple Music, I guess Apple Podcasts, or you can send us an email. I'm gonna read out the email, and then of course the email will be placed in the description below on the different sources that you're viewing us from. The email that you can reach us at to give us comments or questions or topic ideas is gonna be lines and spaces, no caps, 417 at gmail.com. If you just spell out basically the title of the show, Lines and Spaces, 417 at gmail.com. You can reach us there and we will be happy to respond and maybe even take some of your topics and put them into episodes and whatnot. But we have a lot of exciting things going on. We have some plans to do things to expand in the future and get more community engagement. We're gonna have thinking about having some special guests who are in the teaching field to talk about different topics that we aren't super knowledgeable of ourselves, just so we can have these discussions and start talking through things. So, yeah. Any final words, Michaela?
I think you pretty much summed it all up, but have a great rest of your week and make some music.
Yes. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.